Let me introduce our two presenters today. So from PolicyMap, we have Craig Henderson. He has over 25 years experience leading software initiatives that support a wide range of business objectives. Starting in the e-learning space, he led or collaborated on the design and development of pioneering applications for Fortune 500 companies such as Lexus, FedEx, and United Airlines. He was vice president of strategy for that organization before becoming an independent consultant for 7 years. During that time, one of his clients exposed him to the power of web-based mapping applications. This ultimately led him to PolicyMap, where Craig's a member of its senior leadership team. In his current role, he oversees the technology, UX, and overall application roadmap. We're glad to have you here to share your insights, Craig.
Thanks, Dan.
And on the Think Company side, Lizzie Manning is a member of our UX design team. In her role, she gathers insights through user research to inform her design work. Lizzie's background in psychology leads her to champion user needs in all phases of the design process for clients in various industries. On the PolicyMap project, Lizzie worked closely with the PolicyMap team to redesign different feature sets each week and worked with the development team to streamline and tweak elements of the design once they were built in code. I want to thank you both for being here today. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Lizzie and Craig.
Thanks, Dan. I will share my screen. So as Dan mentioned, I'm Lizzie, and I worked as one of the designers on the project with PolicyMap. I will just start us off with a little agenda so we know what we're going to go over today. First, Craig's going to give us some background on PolicyMap, and then we're going to go into a project recap. And you'll see throughout the presentation that this project was really all about modernization. So PolicyMap already has an awesome and really powerful tool, and we were focused on helping the team modernize a few things. We are updating the technology that powers the tool, the design and development processes, and the experience and look and feel of the tool. So after we talk about the project itself, we'll go through a demo to explore the kinds of questions we can answer using the tool. First, in light of the remote world many of us are living in, we'll explore computer access across the United States. And then, using PolicyMap's new COVID-specific maps, we'll explore how we can identify the most vulnerable populations to COVID-19 and what's needed to support them. So I'll pass it off to Craig for some background.
All right, thanks, Lizzie. So PolicyMap was launched 12 years ago with the goal of bringing current and comprehensive data to policymakers and researchers in order to help them make smart and informed decisions in their work. Our belief all along has been that if professionals could interpret geographic data on an easy-to-use interactive map, that they'd have an indispensable tool to assist them in solving some of society's most intractable issues. It could also be used in a variety of ways to help businesses meet their strategic objectives. And so we created what we thought was an intuitive web-based tool for these policymakers, business leaders, and researchers so that they can quickly visualize and understand communities across the US. All along, we've maintained that a primary tenet of this tool is that it should require no special technical skills or software to use it. The data in PolicyMap spans the majority of the social sciences and covers areas such as demographics, health, housing and lending, education, crime, employment, and the economy, among many others. In all, there are over 50,000 individual indicators that can be put on top of a map, and an indicator is a data layer. The PolicyMap staff spends a significant amount of time curating and normalizing this data, which inherently exists in different silos. So those silos can be government agencies or data from a third-party provider or our own proprietary data. And making this data sort of work and play together is a big part of our business, and it's a bigger ongoing undertaking than it may seem. So this is a screenshot of the legacy application, which is still in use, by the way. And we'll talk about that more later. So from a technical standpoint, the legacy platform was built on an older but a very solid open source mapping engine. It's been a real workhorse for us over the years, but newer mapping technologies have sprung up and their fluidity and their features have become the norm on the internet. For some time, we knew that the time was coming for us to migrate to one of these new technologies. And we knew it would be a huge undertaking, as it is for any company making that size of an upgrade. Because we're an open source shop, we had already identified the new mapping engine that we would use, which is the one from Mapbox. their technology over time has become very road tested. So we had that base covered when the project started, but there were a number of other areas in which we needed outside help. So an initial area was in creating and updating the interface for the tool. We wanted the interface update to be a natural evolution from the current or legacy version of PolicyMap. And what I mean by that is that there are many elements in the legacy interface that we think work well and that we didn't want to start over entirely and have the tool completely redesigned. Hand in hand with that approach is that we wanted the existing users to be comfortable with the new interface and see it as something that they recognized, but also as something that had new features readily available and presented in a way that was incorporated in the workflow. So when we started with Think, we made clear that the paradigm for online sites that we would draw from was not from other business mapping applications, but rather retail sites. We looked at interface conventions from sites like Target, Pottery Barn, and Amazon and examined their menus and how they make it easy to find items to buy. We wanted our users to easily be able to find and use the data they're looking for, and for that process to be as easy as those sites make it to find and buy shoes, for instance. So Lizzie, do you want to build on that?
Yeah, so now that we have an understanding of how the engagement started, I'll go into some of the project details. So I was a designer on the project, but worked with Think Company developers along the way. And at Think Company, we're a research and design firm. So we really emphasize that in the beginning of a project, we have some sort of research to understand how users are interacting with the tool or platform that we're working on. And so in this project, it was a little bit different. We had to be a little scrappier. There wasn't budget for this typical research that we do. And instead, we just really relied on Craig and team's knowledge of their users, our knowledge of best practices from other platforms, those different sites that Craig had mentioned. And this really worked because we weren't going for a complete ground up redesign, really just the modernization of a tool that at its core was already working pretty well for users. And this ended up being an important learning for me as a researcher. So knowing that you don't always need to start with that primary research, sometimes it's better to get started, tackle that low-hanging fruit that needs improvement, and save the testing and feedback for later. So in terms of process, we worked through different features each week, really collaboratively passing sketches back and forth so we didn't spend too much time going down the wrong path. Craig and team prioritized the design work for us based on a combination of impact to the user experience and also impact to sales. So you'll see some things highlighted on the slide here. For example, one of the things we worked on first was updating the menu that you see right in the middle. So the menu required the user to maintain focus on an element when you selected a layer. So you kind of had to drag your mouse across and hold it to get to the next layer of the menu. And this was frustrating for users, but also for different sales team members and demos and things like that. We also worked on some features along the bottom here. We wanted to bring those up so that users didn't lose them. Sometimes depending on the browser you were working in, it got a little lost. And then the third thing that's highlighted here is the 3-layer maps. So we spent a significant amount of time reworking this feature because it's one of PolicyMap's most important and most competitive. It allows users to add multiple data points on the map at one time, and you can see then where the data overlaps. And we heard anecdotally that some users often requested this feature because they didn't know how to access it in the tool. So I'll walk you through some of the iterations we went through together as we were redesigning this 3-layer map. Here you're seeing the original PolicyMap, that legacy version Craig mentioned. And you can see in the top utility bar, there's a tab here for the maps that you're on, and then the 3-layer maps is another option. Users could select this, and then the interface would open this map, this menu you see over here, and add multiple layers as they went. So this was a little hard for users to discover, and we started to explore how to first enhance the presence of it and then help users understand its function. So you'll see our version 1 here. And this is where we were, trying to bring more visibility to this function. And we started by first renaming the features. So with this new version of PolicyMap, instead of just adding 3 layers at a time, users could add up to 5 layers. So it's now called the multi-layer map. And then we brought the button down closer to the search bar to increase that visibility in hopes users would see it. And you can see in this modal where we have the menu, we started to build the layers that users were selecting. So as they selected a layer in this menu, it would kind of stack up in a list here, but we were struggling with the space in this modal a little bit. So we move on to version 2. And as we were kind of reviewing that first version, we were asking ourselves if we really needed to use that modal to create a second instance of the menu, or if there was another way to make users feel like it was a different and kind of more enhanced mode that they were in, where they're able to add more layers at a time. So you'll see up here in this left-hand corner, we changed the button to a toggle button. Since the user would always be in either this single or multi-layer mode, we decided that toggle made more sense. And after toggling to the multi-layer mode, the interface would shift to a darker theme. You can see here in this darker gray to signify to the user that something's different. So we also decided in this version to use the full menu and have those layers that users are selecting stack up on the right side panel here. And we had a couple other iterations in between, but now I'm showing the final design. And it looks a lot different because we have, of course, the visual design applied, but here we were really trying to understand how we could increase the feature's prominence even more. So you'll notice we took the toggle from this left-hand corner and placed it directly on the map. And so this was to just increase the prominence. You know, it's a really useful and robust feature, and placing it right on the map would help the user know it's always there for them to use. And this is a good example of one of the trade-offs we were balancing kind of throughout the whole project, you know, how to expose features, but retain most of the space on the screen for the actual map and for the data. So we gave up a little bit of real estate in the right-hand corner, but I felt that was worth the trade-off. So that's just one example of kind of the iterations and different versions we went through as we designed the features. And now I'll just talk a little bit about the dev work as well. So the developers on our team helped provide some additional consulting support to PolicyMap. You know, that included working with the agile processes, kind of demonstrating how we use collaboration tools like Jira. They helped PolicyMap bring their source control management up to date with a more collaborative review process in Git, and assisted with the hiring process, identifying developers that would be needed to integrate front-end work on an ongoing basis. And we did continue to develop and integrate some front-end components into the PolicyMap system. And as our developers were doing that, I was pairing with the developer, you know, literally sitting side by side, making sure each component looked and worked as it should. And I'll show you an example here on this slide. As we were translating the designs into code, we felt there's some room for improvement. So we thought we can consolidate some of the spacing and downsize some of the elements to, again, retain as much real estate as possible for the map. So you can see in these notes here, you know, this might be small things like downsizing an icon, reducing some of the spacing you see here, reducing the size of text. And this is just another example of kind of an updated or more modernized process, because instead of me going back into the design file, creating a whole new file just with these small adjustments, I was really just sitting there with the developer and we were kind of verbally going back and forth, trying things and updating them right in the code. So there wasn't exactly a deliverable. So all of that work, you know, the design work, the development work helped to redesign this legacy system into this platform, a more modern, easy to use tool. As Craig mentioned, you know, built for today's user who's really used to those retail sites, things like Google Maps, Amazon. And you can see it maintains a similar feel, but as we go into this demo, we'll point out important areas of change. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we'll go into a demo to take a look at what computer access looks like in this remote world. And as we do this, we'll be able to show off another feature, the range slider, that helps users kind of narrow down the range of data they're looking at on the map. So I will stop share and pass that back to Craig.
That's up there now, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So yeah, so we're now looking at the legacy platform. And again, at the moment, it has not been phased out entirely. In fact, it is still the default platform because we're finishing up some of the final features that we just haven't gotten to yet. So users land on the legacy platform, then go over to see the beta version, which is the platform rebuild project that we worked on with Think. So we're going to focus on this demo at looking at another specific feature. There's a whole bunch of different features in this application, and there were several that we thought we could target to really improve the interface on. And one that really came to mind based on a few other things we had seen just out in the world that we thought we could apply our smarts to and our experience to and really improve is this range, range chooser, as we call it. So if you're looking at a map like this, this is households with any type of computer. So up to 77% is going to be that lightest purple. So that those are going to be the households that have the fewest amount of computer access, and the dark purple, 88.9 and more, that's going to be the counties that have the the greatest number of households with at least one computer. So so this data these are based on quintiles, so it's split into 20%, 20%. What that means is that those are exactly 20% of the data in each of those 5 ranges. But one of the most powerful features in PolicyMap overall has always been the fact that you can change these ranges and update them to make the map reflect values that is more important to you in the work that you're working on. So in this example, again, what we'll do, and this is again the legacy platform. So this was built almost 10 years ago. It's you would go in and let's say I wanted to make that bottom range be, let's go up to 70%, which will which will extend out the percentage of households that don't have a computer. And if I click apply, the map will refresh, and you're going to see more of the map in purple now at this point. So that's very powerful. And again, but it's sort of an old paradigm and it's really not very visual. So working with Think and also looking at some outside examples, we'll look at the same feature here in the platform rebuild version. Both these are live right now on the internet, by the way, too. This is not sort of like a demo version of anything you're seeing. So the new range finder is a visual bar where you see these values now in this kind of stair-step manner. And if I wanted to change the map, do the same thing I just did, and go from 77 down to 70, I would simply drag the marker down to 70. I can also update it here and just have it go to 70 if I want to. So you're seeing, and then the data updates in real time, obviously. So you're able to see now the data vis-a-vis the, your ranges vis-a-vis the histogram, which shows the distribution of the data. So again, if we want to say, okay, let's see where this is really sort of even more extreme, let's just keep sliding it out, right? And you saw the map update in real time there. Conversely, I could say which counties have the populations with the greatest number of households that have at least one computer. I can move this one way out in this direction, and these are the counties that emerge in that category. So we think this is a really powerful example of taking kind of an older internet paradigm of type in, click apply, refresh, and applying a very powerful visual to it, in addition to a very fluid a UX experience of just being able to sort of slide the bars and have the map update in real time, so that you can see your results sort of in real work, or in real time. A lot of people who use PolicyMap, it's much more powerful to be like, oh, I just want to see it a little bit different. I want to change that slider a little bit, and to not have to kind of like go back and re-enter a number, click apply. This is a much more powerful way of being able to make those little tweaky changes. So.
Yeah, and you'll see Craig had shown us in the original version how this was vertical. And so one of the biggest changes you see here is how that kind of pops out into a horizontal bar. And as we were working through the designs, this is something we were, experimenting with, because if the bar was vertical and we were kind of moving the slider up and down that way, there just wasn't as much room, and it didn't make sense in terms of displaying that histogram that shows that frequency, which turned out to be really helpful to users. So you can see with the horizontal version, you get a little bit more room, and you still get to see things change on the map. So it's not covering too much. But one thing we did have in the original design was those numbers were all sort of lined up at the bottom. And you can see even here a little bit, as they get closer, it kind of squishes all together. So that's an example of something, making those numbers kind of step down in that fashion is an example of something that once people were really using it, we were in development, it made more sense to change because things weren't always going to stay in those 5 kind of spaced out intervals as we were working with in the original design.
Right. And I mean, I think Lizzie points out a really good point here about, like, obviously this is a vertical orientation and it has to be just logically, but this actually really shouldn't be vertical. And when we were experimenting with trying to do a slider up and down, it just was so awkward and it didn't feel like the way people would use something. So we think what we ended up with here is something where the two of them actually work together in unison quite well. But there took a bit of iteration and back and forth to get to this point. So, all right, Lizzie, should I go on to the next one now?
Yeah, great.
Okay. All right, so now we'll look at multi-layer map as it turned out, and we're going to do an example of really it's about vulnerable populations in the context of COVID. PolicyMap has COVID specific data in it right now about rates and hospitalizations, things like that. However, what we're going to look at here is vulnerable communities and how a planner might use this tool to identify a potential problem that's coming up in the public health space and what they might do, and to then be able to sort of have the data to understand that some kind of action is going to need to be taken. So we start here with populations. So again, I'm sorry, multi-layer map, again, so you can put more than one layer on the map. So what's on the first layer that's on the map right now, looking at Philadelphia here, is median income, median household income of 35,000 and less. So these are poor areas in town. And what we're going to do is put a couple of health indicators on top of this and try to identify more specifically which neighborhoods and which census tracts are at particular risk for flooding the hospitals in their area. So the CDC identified that diabetes was one of the 4 kind of main pre-existing conditions that could be a problem for people to get COVID. So if I put diabetes on top of this map, it will update, and I'm going to update this to say, let's look at neighborhoods where it's at least 10% of the population has diabetes. Even though this data is a bit old, it's still current enough to, to be a value here for this discussion. So I don't know if you folks noticed, but some of those purple areas kind of disappeared, because what happens is if you click on the purple area, it means that both layers are meeting the criteria in the slider bar. And if you click on an area where it's not purple, it means that at least one of the data layers is not meeting the criteria. So we look at diabetes. Let's also put asthma on there. And then I'm also going to bump this up to 10%. And you'll see the map update. Some of those areas just disappeared there. So, so these would be areas, again, census tracts that meet these 3 criteria. These are poorer parts of town where there's a high pre-existing condition or high pre-existing rates of diabetes and asthma. And now let's take a look at where the hospitals in the city are in relation to these purple areas. So I'm going to go in here. I'm going to put on the hospitals, and there they are. And on this icon, I can, you know, if they start small, for instance, like that, I can easily go in here and change the color and bump it up just to sort of pop them out a little bit. And so if I'm in sort of, you know, hospital management, some kind of health planning capacity, public health planning, I'm going to see right away that these hospitals are likely to be deluged. And so this is a flag to me to say, you know, we're going to need to do something about this, because these communities are more likely to have higher COVID rates, and these are the hospitals that they're most likely to use. So it's an example, you know, obviously, you know, you can see the power of the tool, that in real time, you know, you're able to get this kind of visual display of your city, right? And what you're looking at and what issues might emerge and where specifically. So with that, you should be armed to hopefully be able to come up with a better solution to this, you know, to potential upcoming problem or upcoming crisis. So, and again, you can put more layers on. So we could put the other pre-existing conditions that the CDC has outlined and, you know, further narrow down the map if we wanted to do that. Another thing is if we wanted to say, let's just move diabetes up to 15% or, you know, 13%, and you'll see some of those areas disappeared. So these are truly the areas where the problem is potentially more extreme. So this version, again, is an AND version, meaning it's an intersection. So all three areas meet the criteria in order for it to be, for the purple areas to show. What we worked with Think on, and that's a brand new feature in Platform Rebuild, is the OR version of this same feature. So the OR version is, each layer has its own visual depiction, and they just sort of layer on top of each other. So if I switch over to the OR version, what we see is, and I'm going to update these real quick. What we see now is basically kind of a different depiction of what we saw on the AND version, but with more information as well. So the purple areas are going to be where both of these cross hatch marks are you know, intersecting, as well as the color. So it's the same as the purple area in the previous map. But now we can see where, you know, the diabetes or asthma, diabetes being, you know, going up on the right, and asthma going down on the right, extend out into neighboring census tracts around the city or in other parts of the city. So you might say, okay, well, the income might be lower up here, but look, we still have these health issues, right? So again, that's an example of how a planner or researcher, somebody using this tool as a practitioner, could take advantage of this information in real time. So that might just spark their head or their thinking to say, you know, I want to go in there and actually look at this a little bit and just kind of play around with some of these knobs and different data sets and whatnot to sort of get a better sense of that community. Another thing that the AND feature does that a lot of practitioners want to do is you can very easily change the hatch marks to make them be the same, or use the same color more than once. So in this example, if I switch it to be the same, the value here would be, okay, health conditions is now like one variable. So we know that like problems with diabetes and asthma are all of that hatch mark. And we're just going to look at health sort of, you know, in a sort of more than one manner, and compare it with the median household income, which is the color. So you can do that, you know, by doubling up, again, by doubling up either any of the hatch marks or the color. So some of the things that we worked on with Think on this too is we played around a bit with different colors, with different types of like patterns, these hatch marks. The colors we originally had, instead of it being this kind of array of options, we had the primary colors be like the first three choices, and then we had like white. And what happened was, like, when you combined blue and yellow, you got green. When you combined, you know, red and yellow, you got orange. And the map turned into like a kaleidoscope that had, it became just this overwhelming mix of colors. It just didn't seem to have any rhyme or reason. Plus red has a certain connotation of kind of bad, and green sort of doesn't. And so that just wasn't really working either. So iteratively, we went back and forth with Lizzie and the team, you know, and her team to come up with what we landed on here, which we think works pretty well, and by limiting the choices to the ones that we went with. So.
Yeah, and this idea of having the and or the or operation in this legend here is something that we iterated on a bunch as well. So you can see how there's some kind of global controls, you would say, for the entire legend, where you have the and the or you have the minimize or kind of X to remove from the map, and that takes care of the whole legend. But then you see on each individual layer, there's kind of a multitude of actions the user could take. You know, you have the little eyeball that allows you to turn the layer on or off without fully removing it. So you'll see Craig just turn that off right there. So it's kind of another layer of flexibility where you don't have to decide you're going to completely remove it and then go back into the menu to get it later. You can just kind of test out there and see. You know, you have ways to dig into the data source. The eye icon tells you more about the layer, but then the link to the source tells you more about that. So there were a lot of different pieces to kind of fit into each of those specific layers, in addition to what we had in the kind of overall legend. So that was certainly a design challenge, and something we worked on together to figure out which of these controls was most important to see per layer, because we can also expand each of those layers to get a little bit more.
Right. So if you expand it out, you can change the year of the data or the variable. And we went, you know, we had a good number of conversations about, because there's only so much screen real estate and we don't want to have absolute info overkill. And there's quite a bit going on the screen here right now. It's like, what are the absolute mandatory things that you need to see on the legend for one of these layers? And it was obviously the name of the data set, and kind of goes without saying. The source we felt was that big. Obviously the ranges that you have selected, because that's what you're looking at on the map. And then it's also really important for people to understand which geographic boundary they're looking at, and then they can switch it if they want. And so now you're down at block group, but you need to know what, you know, that particular indicator, in this case, the colored one, which geographic boundary it's being, you know, it's using. So.
Yeah, and so this is the multi-layer legend, but you will notice on the right side, there's that toggle I was mentioning in the beginning of the presentation where you can kind of flip back to just look at a single layer if you want. And that has its own legend. So there was kind of some consolidation and consistency we needed to ensure crossed both.
I'll show that real quick. So if we go back to single layer, now the map updates with the different legend, and just that, it asked me which of those layers I wanted to put on, and I chose the first one. So.
Great. Well, as you can see, you know, there's a lot of kind of behind the scenes work for all these different features, but in this new version, things kind of are a little bit more up to date, easier to use, hopefully more exposed. So I think we might be ready for questions now. Craig, do you have anything else to add?
No, I don't think so.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Craig and Lizzie. That's really fascinating to get a behind the scenes look at sort of how an app is made, how you think about approaching a product and developing it over time, and then actually, you know, demoing some of these features, and pretty relevant ones too at that for right now. I'll give everyone a minute to just, you know, think about this, digest it, and please use the Q&A tool within Zoom to ask some questions. And I'm sure Lizzie and Craig will be happy to field them. In the meantime, I'm looking at the questions that have been submitted here, and there's some good stuff. You know, as someone who actually had the opportunity to be able to use PolicyMap and just mess around with layering data and finding some interesting insights by almost randomly choosing different data sets. There's a question here about asking a little bit more about where the data in PolicyMap comes from. Can you provide a little insight into the sources of this data? I think it seems really rich and pretty broad, even with just the health data that you were able to show us.
Yeah, so I mean, the sources are really quite vast, as you can imagine, but census and American Community Survey make up a good bulk of it. That's public data sets. But there's also, if you go into, there's data from HUD, there's data from the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, HMDA. There's data from the FBI for crime. There's data from different proprietary sources from around school data. So if we go in here, I'm going to open our data directory and you can just take a quick look. So I'll scroll just a little bit here, but so ACS is, part of like census, and I am going to just look real quick. So yeah, National Center for Educational Statistics, Kaiser Health News. So if I click on any of these, different HUD data sets. So this is our data directory that we're looking at, which is what you come to when you click on that source link in the legend. Great Schools, that's a third-party provider, a private company that does sort of value add to school data. We have FEMA data for floods, FDIC. So yeah, it's just, a vast amount of data sources. And as I said earlier in the presentation, this is what we have a whole staff that, does nothing but curates this data, gets it, first of all, then normalizes it, makes it work kind of in one, unified platform. So.
Yeah, it's incredible. So Craig, dozens, if not hundreds of data sources?
Yeah. It's probably, I think some of these are kind of, they're different versions from the same source, but yeah, I'd probably dozens and dozens, I'd say that, yeah. So.
Yeah, it seems like there's a couple questions just around understanding PolicyMap a little bit more. And one here in the chat asks, what type of users subscribe to PolicyMap? And can you share some other use cases or examples of how or what people might use the tool for?
Yeah, so as in looking at the demo, you can gather that just with all of this kind of data that's in the application, and the different tools to be able to manipulate the data, that the sort of number of use cases is almost infinite, right? But that said, we tend to bucket our users into about 6 different general categories, and they are academic, government, commercial, finance, health, nonprofits, and public libraries. And that's not to say that maybe there should be a catch-all one for sort of everyone else too, but that's kind of how we bucket it. And some use cases would be, like in academic, obviously both faculty and students use it for research and for their own, whatever endeavors they're working on in a university setting. It's also used as an in-class teaching aid at times. For governments our government clients are often really interested in specific communities and some kind of initiative that they're doing in that community, and they want to understand the real makeup of those communities based on sort of the actual data, so they can make data-driven decisions. So we had a client that was dealing with blight in their community, and they wanted to understand more of the demographics and where they should be putting their resources in. So that's kind of an example of something like that. In finance, we have a lot of customers that use it for like property profiles. There's a lot of other examples there. Health can, an example of like the one I just showed is a good health example. We also had a city in Florida at the beginning of the COVID crisis that looked at their demographics using PolicyMap and figured out where to set up testing centers for the virus based on just, drilling down into where they thought the areas of most need would be. But in general, yeah, I think the common thread on all of these is that people are using the data to make data-driven decisions and not just trusting their gut and their instinct. So.
Yeah, that's great. It looks like we have a question here from Hannah. So if Hannah's on and would like to ask her question, I'm going to unmute you right now, and then you can ask this, Craig and Lizzie. Hey, Hannah, you should be on.
Hi. I just wanted to ask what the biggest roadblock you hit during this process was and how you got past it.
We can probably answer that from a couple angles. I can, for the earlier part of the process, talk maybe about the design, and then Craig can talk more about the development and getting this out there. But I think in terms of, as we were going through and redesigning this, maybe not necessarily roadblocks, but just making sure we were working quickly. This update this redesign was going to go through a couple of different phases. We needed the design, so then we could start building the pattern library and pass it off. So I think making sure we weren't working in waterfall. As we were designing one feature, we always would need to go back and kind of make sure everything was consistent and updated. So kind of working out how we were doing that kind of in mini sprints, I would say was something to work through, just process wise.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else you can think of, Craig?
No, I mean, I think we as two teams worked really well together. It was very iterative. I don't think we had, I mean, I agreed the timeline is probably the most challenging thing, but that would always be the case in any project of this scale, because there are so many features in this thing, and we've built little things over the years, and all of a sudden we had to deal with everything at once. And that was just kind of hard to just sort of get a handle on all of that and make sure everything was covered. But it wasn't, I don't know if I really call that a roadblock. It was just sort of, harder part of the project kind of thing that we all had to kind of just figure out. So.
All right, thank you so much.
Sure.
Thanks, Hannah. We appreciate the question. Going back to the data sources, I found out that Elizabeth Nash from PolicyMap is actually in the audience here. And she commented to me that, she had a few other things to add around the data, as well as creating your own data around some of the COVID-19 risk index that was featured in the New York Times. So I'm going to unmute Elizabeth and just allow her to elaborate on that a little bit.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I just wanted to make sure, I know I typed it in the chat, but so Craig is right that we have hundreds of sources of publicly available data, proprietary data that we vet, and that we are really careful about choosing to add or not add to PolicyMap. We have definitely decided not to go with data if we're not comfortable with it. But we also, a couple of years ago, decided to start making our own data because we knew that users needed to see sort of what you've been showing today in one click. So we have an index like the one that you mentioned that we were asked to make by the New York Times this year. And we have medical spending estimates that we've created because we know that there's a lot of concern around medical spending. So I would encourage, for folks who are looking at PolicyMap to take a look in the new platform. Through the menus, they have a little orange P that I think you all helped us design to indicate which are the data sets that we make ourselves. So thank you.
Absolutely. I'll keep you on the line here for a second too, as another question kind of emerged to me as Craig and Lizzie were giving the presentation. Just given, I was curious if you've seen any recent trends that have emerged recently, just in terms of how people are using PolicyMap during national events like COVID or this recent election season. Are there new ways that PolicyMap is being used that you maybe didn't necessarily anticipate or have seen trends emerge around?
Definitely. When the pandemic hit, we were really quick to respond because we knew that we had a lot of data that could be very helpful to those who needed to address the public health crisis. And so Craig's team took it upon themselves to build a freestanding publicly available tool that's separate from the PolicyMap tool that's different from the way users interacted with PolicyMap in the sense that it starts out asking the user questions about COVID. And you can click through to see either the map that answers the question or a blog that we've written that pulls in a bunch of different sources for how to use the data and make it actionable. And so that's a shift that we took very, very early on in the pandemic. I think that during the election, we have election data as well, and we know that people are using it to sort of understand what happened in the 2016 election and think more about the 2020 election.
So this is the COVID tool here. And certain, we started with kind of canned quick answers that people might want to have answered. And so, if you click the answer to one of these, the map will zoom to the location. And in this case, this is the question and it's answered here. But I'm glad Elizabeth jumped on because she knows the data far better than I do in PolicyMap, and this is her area. So thank you, Elizabeth, for illuminating things a bit there.
Thank you.
Yeah, appreciate it. Looking at the Q&A again, if you have questions, go ahead and submit them now. But another one that's in here asked anonymously: have you seen any changes in the way that users interact with the tool now that the enhancements you discussed have been made? Craig, I guess that one's for you on the product side.
Yeah, and honestly, I'd say it's a little too early for us to tell on that right now. And that's partly because our focus is still kind of on finishing the final pieces of the tool. Most of what, we've had anecdotal feedback and a lot of really positive feedback about just how superior the sort of fluidity of this map is, and the interface is just it's just cleaner, as you've seen. But how that's actually kind of translated into specifically different use cases, I don't really have a lot of information on. We don't know a lot about that specifically right now. But I think that's partly also because this hasn't been out there all that long. And as I said, that hasn't really been our focus since it has been out there. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. In the talk, you mentioned that there was sort of a natural evolution, that this was a sort of natural evolution from the original interface. How did you both go about determining what should change and what should more or less remain the same?
Well, it's a good question. And it's kind of a, try to not, try to keep the answer to that fairly brief, but it's so at the end of the day here, you have, so this is a data layer right now with this hover feature that the previous application did not allow, the technology did not allow for. And this is the legend for that, for this particular data layer. So if I come up here and put on a point data set on top of it as well. So this is HUD multifamily, and I'm gonna just kind of filter it down a bit. So fundamentally, we thought that this concept of like, there's one type of legend for the layer, and there's one type of legend for the points. And if you add additional points, that they would simply kind of stack down here. That may not seem like it's that big of a deal, but we thought just fundamentally that was just a solid, good design. The legends were dated, no doubt, right? And they needed to be updated and modernized in terms of their look and a little streamlined in terms of the functionality, like the range thing that we saw. But this concept of like, one tenet for PolicyMap all along has been, we want to have legends that are as clearly as possible showing you what you're looking at on the map. So that sounds like it's a no-brainer thing. If you look at a lot of other business mapping applications out there, it's amazing to us how I'm like, what am I looking at? There's no legend, there's no title of the map. What's the date? I mean, what this is, right? So, so that's an example of something that, we thought was just good design. There's just no reason to kind of reinvent that. And then there were other things like the feature, the range finder. There's other examples like that where we thought there really is room for improvement and making something more visual. And then we took advantage of that where we thought that made sense. So.
Yeah, and just to add there from the design side, I think exactly what Craig's talking about, where it might seem so obvious to someone who's involved in the data and kind of knows this world. A designer, always is wanting to make things look kind of clean and hide away different things that you might not need. But really what we learned throughout this process was that you needed to use all of the space and make sure that the information and all those different little functions we talked about in the legends were there, because that's really what people are using. And so kind of adjusting to that, I think, and Craig's team was a really good check on that. When we would redesign something and maybe leave out an important piece of information or kind of tuck it away, we would rely on kind of the original version and what was working there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Lizzie, to follow up on that, I'm curious, you mentioned how a lot of the new components or features in PolicyMap now originally kind of started with inspiration taken from a best practice somewhere else out there in the web. As a designer, I think we just kind of intuitively figure out how to translate something from one place into a new context. But could you break that down a little bit for us? For instance, how do you take a best practice from a consumer-focused site like ESPN or an e-commerce site and then translate it into a functional app like this?
Yeah, I think a big difference, it definitely is not one-to-one. A big difference is the amount of data and information. So that was constantly in my mind as the designer, how can you maybe use this pattern that in terms of a menu, for example, functions really well and helps you get to what you need to, but retain all of that important information to guide you. So I think it was kind of using that, as you said, as inspiration and sketching out different versions, and then relying on Craig and team as sort of a check. Did we cover off on all those important points, and does it have that element of kind of, that 2020 user who uses Google Maps all the time, and we want them to be able, we want to take advantage of those patterns that do exist out in the world, because there's no reason to reinvent the wheel, as Craig has said, but make sure it kind of fits to this context. So, working together is really important on that front.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. If anyone else has more questions, please add them to the chat. Looks like we're kind of winding down on the open questions, but we do have one more in here. So in the meantime, I'll ask this. Did you run into any ADA compliance design issues on this project? And how did you take these factors into consideration? So obviously with data visualization, accessibility, and considerations around like colorblindness is a pretty big deal. What types of considerations did you all make as you were designing and creating this product?
Yeah, so let me start with that. First of all, we've had this conversation about just, colorblindness, or actually really more about the need to use a mouse to pan on the map as much as possible. Now you can, obviously enter a city and go to it, right? But there is really no way of getting around the panning, which the customers that we've talked to are okay with that, right? But in the legacy version, we had done kind of a retrofit of, creating the tab controls to the different locations on the screen. And also our use of colors had not been vetted at all or anything like that. Colors for like buttons and things like that. So one thing that was, and also, again, our development team, the team I manage, this is just like ADA compliance is just not our specialty. It's an esoteric thing. It's kind of hard to really understand hard and fast rules around it. And if you don't have experience with it, you think you're doing it as well as you can, but oftentimes you're not. And it's really hard to get a check on that. So the Think team was really helpful to us in terms of from the get-go in those pattern libraries that Lizzie alluded to earlier, that the focus is clear, and it's not only is it clear, it's absolute, like that focus right there, which is an ADA thing, is to standard. And then one thing that we found as the project was, midstream, is that when I believe, as I remember it, Lizzie, somebody on your team kind of did a sweep and just made, for an ADA sweep to make sure that things were good. And we found that the shade of orange that is represented there, or in some of our, some of the alert messages that we have, where, there's the close button and things, the orange was too light. It wasn't ADA compliant, so we darkened it down a bit. And that's something that our team never would have known on our own. And so that was really helpful. So it's something that we can call out to potential customers, when they ask about, ADA compliance. I cite these as examples of things that, where we've sort of, I think, kind of gone the extra mile to make sure that we're following the rules correctly.
Yeah, and we had another visual designer working on this project as well, who's kind of pulling from the brand colors. And so once we were using kind of that lighter orange, as Craig mentioned, sort of on a button with maybe white text, we'll always do tests to follow the WCAG standards, and that didn't pass. So we had to darken that orange, as Craig mentioned. And that's just something we kind of track all along when we're working through the design system colors.
Great. Well, it looks like we've answered all the open questions. So I'd like to thank you both for your time and just the amount of incredible insight that you provided here. Again, I think it's really cool to be able to get to see a behind the scenes look at how products are made, what some of those critical decisions look like, how you usher a very complex app like this through a redesign, and be able to provide this amazingly rich data to a broad audience. So it's really a fantastic accomplishment here that you both have contributed to. And yeah, thank you so much for sharing. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure, thanks, Dan.